Hey everybody, we're back. This is the West Atlanta Bourbon Society, and we're doing the introduction to bourbon. I'm Kevin Jablonski, and this is
Leslie Walker Jr.
Hey, he's a new member to bourbon. He's new to bourbon, and he's going to be asking me some questions to understand what bourbon is and how it all works. So we'll dive on into it. What's your first question there, Les?
My first question is, what is bourbon and what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey?
Okay, so every bourbon is actually a whiskey, but not every whiskey is actually a bourbon. To be a bourbon, there's 5 things that it needs to be to qualify to legally be a bourbon. The first is it needs to be produced in the United States. Now, it used to be it was produced only in Kentucky, but they actually opened that up to the whole United States. The second thing is at least 51% corn. So the mash bill of what they use to make the distillate that goes into the barrels has to be at least 51% corn. Mm-hmm. There's 4 grains that you can classically use to make different spirits. It's corn, rye, wheat, and barley. But for it to be bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. Now, the other 49 can be kind of, whatever the distilleries decide, which we're going to talk about that a little later. But it has to be at least 51% corn. The third thing is has to be aged in new American white oak barrels, charred barrels, okay? So it has to be new barrels, new American white oak barrels. It has to be white oak, it has to be American white oak, and it has to be new barrels, brand new barrels. Every time they pour distillate into it, it needs to be a new barrel. And the fourth thing is it has to be distilled to no more than 160 proof. Okay? So when it's distilled, when it's run through the still and it comes out, and they separate which we'll talk about a little later, the heads, the tails, and the hearts, it has to be at least no more than 160 proof when it's distilled. And then when it's entered into the barrel, it has to enter in the barrel at no more than 125 proof. Okay? Now, one of the other things that is like the 6th little caveat of bourbon is it's bottled at least 80 proof or more. So anything under 80 proof is not really a bourbon. It's just a flavored whiskey or different whiskey, but it has to be at least 80 proof to be called a bourbon. So those are the 5 things that make it a bourbon. Bourbon is usually very corn forward because 51% of it's corn. It actually started by Elijah Craig, who was a Baptist minister and a distiller at the same time. Church and State in Kentucky that was the first one to use American white oak barrels. So Elijah Craig was one of the first ones to do that and distill it like that.
Speaking of barrels, so is this made actually in a barrel with the grain and the corn and everything you mentioned? It's not like a cognac where it's more grape based.
Right. So what they do is they actually take the corn and the different grains, they put it into a fermenter. It sits and ferments for a while. They add in a little bit of yeast to start activating the process of the fermenting, and then they pour it out into another mash pot, and then from there they send it into a distiller, a copper still. Mm-hmm. Some use copper stills, some use other type of stills, but the still basically heats it up. They boil it and heat it up, and at that point they take the alcohol off. The alcohol comes out through a gas. They cool it back down into what they call the white dog mash, or the whiskey right here, like Buffalo Trace has.
I was going to ask you about that white whiskey.
Yes, this is that white dog mash. So this is what the liquor looks like before it goes into the barrel. So this is bourbon pre-barrel before it goes into the barrel. And then once they get this, okay, there's something called hearts, heads, and tails. Now, they used to say that the heads and the tails would make you blind and kill you because that was what all the impurities were in the heads and the tails. Mm-hmm. So that most distillers and distilleries like Willett and some of the other distilleries, they just use the hearts. So they take the heads and the tails, they filter it out, run it back through later to get more hearts, but they take just the hearts, mm-hmm. which is the middle section of the white dog mash or the corn liquor or whatever you want to call that, the unaged spirit. And then they take this and they pour this into the barrel. When they pour this into the barrel, from it sitting in the barrel over the seasons, summer and winter, the barrel, as wood does, it contracts and expands, being out in the weather. So when it contracts and expands, it lets this wonderful white juice go in and out, and as it goes into the barrel, it pulls out all the tannins, pulls out the sweetness, pulls out everything that's in that wood. So that American white oak, it pulls all the good flavor out of that oak into this. And then that's what mixes up to finally become bourbon. So when you actually get it out of the barrel, it looks something like this. See how it's nice and brown? Mm-hmm. It's been in the barrel, so it's aged. And that is, my friend, what we call bourbon. Now, okay, now there's two types of bourbon. There's regular bourbon, and then there's straight bourbon. So for it to be called straight bourbon, it technically has to be aged at least 2 years in a barrel, okay? And you cannot add any flavor or coloring to it. So no dyes or color to make it, darker. It's all, if it's straight bourbon, it came out straight as it was from the bottle. Now they can proof it down, but the only thing they can add to proof it down is water. No flavor, no coloring, nothing like that. And if it doesn't have the age statement on it, it has to be at least 4 years. So most straight bourbon is at least 4 years old, but it can be 2 years, but they have to put on it straight bourbon aged 2 years, up until 4 years. Once it hits the 4-year mark, they don't have to put an age statement on it. Straight bourbon is just 4 years. But between the 2 and 4 year period, they have to put that age statement on the bottle to legally be called straight bourbon.
What do they do with the barrels after they emptied it out for a straight bourbon?
Awesome, yeah. So the barrels have to be, like I said, one of the caveats of it being bourbon is they have to age it in new charred white oak American barrels. Well, they can't reuse the barrels, so what do? They sell the barrels, and they either cut them up as barrel chips, which a lot of people can buy that at Walmart. You can buy the barrel chips that they cut up, and you can use it to smoke your meats. Okay. They sell it to the Caribbean for rum, because rum is aged in barrels. So actually, if you drink rum, some rum is aged in old ex-bourbon barrels. Wow. So you get that same flavor, and that's how they get that same darkness again. And Scotland is the number one buyer of the barrels from the bourbon industry, because
more like Scotch.
Right, they buy it over there, and they put their distilled into it, which is usually single malt or barley, and they make Scotch whiskey out of it. But Scotch doesn't have to be in a new barrel. It can be in a reused American white oak or European oak barrels.
So what's the difference in the taste between the Scotch and bourbon and the whiskey?
So bourbon is a little different. The mouthfeel of bourbon is real sweet, real watery, not so tannic most of the times, depending on which bourbons you get. But unlike cognac has a wine taste to it because it's made out of distilled, grapes and stuff like that. It's made out of different stuff than what the bourbon is made out of. But it's more of a tannic, not sweet and real dry spirit, whereas bourbon is a very wet and very sweet spirit. It's one of the best sipping spirits that you have out there. There's bourbon, there's rum, and there's cognac that can usually be sipped. Some of the other ones, like the unaged spirits, are usually shot, like vodka, or used in mixes, vodka and tequila. But unless you're talking about the Anejo tequila, which is actually aged in barrels, again, they sell some of the bourbon barrels to other tequila distributors that actually barrel age their tequila in bourbon.
I don't want to hold up too much of your time, but can you tell me what kind of bourbons you got lined up right here, and then we can start tasting?
Sure, no problem. Before we get into that, like I said, there was 4 different types of grains. So we need to talk about that. There's corn, which is 51% of what bourbon is made of, but there's 3 other grains that play a very important part into what we have here today. Those other 3 grains are rye, malted barley, and wheat. Those are the three grains that are used outside of the 51% corn. So what you see here is an array of different products that have different grain mixtures in them that are outside that 49%. That other percentage of grains are a mixture of different ones. So this right here is the Pappy 23 year. This is the Pappy Van Winkle, what everybody dies over, sell their firstborn kid after.
That's age 23 years.
23 years in a barrel. Yep, it sure is. But it's a wheated bourbon. So a wheated bourbon is a bourbon that's 51% corn, but the other 49%, a majority of that 49% is actually wheat. So they use wheat. It's going to have a real soft feel, real soft mouth feel. Won't burn very much, more doughy in texture. And that's why everybody likes the wheaters, because there's no burn. It's very easy to sip. Then we have next to that the Old Grandad. Old Grandad is a high rye whiskey, or high rye bourbon. It's a bourbon. So it's 51% corn, but the other 49%, a majority of that, is rye. So it's going to have a lot of spice to it, heat to it, but a lot of flavor. Rye brings flavor and spice and heat to the mixture. Okay, right here we have a Hofstadter's Family Reserve, which I think was aged 16 years. This is a rye whiskey, which at this point is not a bourbon anymore because it's 100% rye. Remember, bourbon has to be 51% corn. So this is a complete rye whiskey, which will be very, very flavorful, very spicy, but have a lot of burn to it. Then we have Old Forester Birthday Bourbon, which is another bourbon. It is made of 51% corn, and the other 49 is of the other three distilled grains. Then we have Russell's Reserve, which is a Wild Turkey product. Okay, it is made and bottled by Wild Turkey Distillery, and Eddie Russell. This is his tribute to his father for the bourbon. It is made. Wild Turkey is very high corn, so they are in the 60 to 75% corn ratio with their bourbon. So again, it has to be 51% corn to be bourbon, but it can also be 75% corn and still be considered bourbon. So this is a high corn, so it's going to be real sweet, real corny tasting. This right here is Old Fitzgerald 12 years, another wheated bourbon, just like the Pappy Van Winkle that we have right here. It's 51% corn, and the rest is majority wheat, and then some other grains. And then right here we have a Winter's Nice Dram. Okay, this is another rye whiskey that I was talking about, the blended straight rye whiskeys. It is made out of complete rye, but it is barrel aged in Syrah in port barrels. They French oak port barrels. They finish it in French oak port barrels. So remember, I was explaining to you that for it to be bourbon and be straight bourbon, it can't be refinished in anything. Well, sometimes they take certain whiskeys, and since it's not considered a bourbon, that was not considered a bourbon, they take the rye whiskey and then age it in sherry barrels, port barrels, wine barrels, and it gives it a different flavor. It cuts off some of the bite of the rye, stuff like that. So, when you're out there looking, just remember, for it to be bourbon, it has to be 51% corn, and then try to, take some tastes and find out what it is that you really like, because, as a new bourbon connoisseur, a new person coming into bourbon, you need to kind of get your palate to where it needs to be. So you want to try all these different renditions to understand the difference between wheated bourbons, rye bourbons, more malted bourbons, or barley bourbons, or high corn bourbons. You want to see what your taste profile is, and then start tasting from there. It's all about your experience, because I hope you have an enjoyable experience with your bourbon journey, and I want you to find what you like. Now, after this, also stay tuned. We're going to actually do a how to drink and taste bourbon, where this gentleman will be having his first real tasting with some different bourbons, and we're going to teach him how to, the glasses that we use, the limestone water, that playing into it, and adding water to the bourbon, and how to chew your whiskey and all that good stuff. So stay tuned. See us. We'll be right back.